Have you ever stood in front of a mirror and wondered, who, exactly, is looking back at you? Not your face. Not your name. Not the story you tell people at dinner parties or on your resume. But you, the one doing the looking. The human mind is the most complex object in the known universe. More intricate than a galaxy. More layered than the deepest ocean. And yet, it is the one thing most of us never truly study. We learn history. We learn mathematics. We learn how to drive a car and how to cook a meal. But almost no one teaches us how our own mind works. How our thoughts are formed. Why we feel what we feel. Why we do things we swear we never do. Why we repeat the same painful patterns year after year. Like a broken record no one knows how to stop. That changes today. Welcome to the hidden architecture of the mind. A complete journey through the science and psychology of what makes us human. Over the course of the next 2 hours, we are going to travel deep into the machinery behind your behavior, your emotions, your relationships, and your identity. We are going to explore the unconscious forces that quietly drive almost everything you do. We are going to understand why your brain so often works against you, and more importantly, how to work with it. We are going to look at the psychology of trauma, of love, of fear, of meaning. And by the time this journey ends, you will see yourself, and every other human being you encounter, in a completely different light. So find a comfortable place. Take a slow, deep breath. And let us begin. Part 1. The Iceberg. Understanding the Unconscious Mind. Chapter 1. The 90% You Cannot See. In 1895, a Viennese neurologist named Sigmund Freud proposed something that shocked the scientific world of his time. He suggested that the mind we are aware of, the thoughts we can observe, the feelings we can name, the decisions we believe we make consciously, that visible mind represents only a fraction of our total mental life. The rest, the vast, dark, churning ocean beneath the surface, operates completely outside our awareness. Picture an iceberg. Above the water, glistening in the cold light, you can see the tip. Sharp, visible, defined. This is your conscious mind. Your immediate thoughts. The words you are hearing right now. The sensations in your body as you listen. But beneath the waterline, stretching down into the cold, dark depths, is the enormous body of the iceberg itself. Invisible. But carrying almost all the weight. Freud called this the unconscious. And while many of his specific theories have been revised or replaced by modern neuroscience, his core insight has been confirmed again and again. The vast majority of mental processing happens below the level of awareness. Modern neuroscientists estimate that the unconscious mind processes approximately 11 million bits of information per second. The conscious mind? About 40 bits per second. 40 bits. This means that for every single thought you are consciously aware of, your brain is silently processing roughly 275,000 thoughts you will never know about. Let that land for a moment. You are not the captain of your ship. Not entirely. You are, more accurately, an officer on the bridge, receiving reports from a vast crew working below decks. You make decisions based on those reports. But you never see the crew itself. You never witness the actual machinery. And here is what matters. That crew was trained a long time ago. Many of its habits, its instincts, its automatic responses were programmed during your childhood, long before you had the reasoning capacity to evaluate whether those programs were actually serving you. Psychologists call these unconscious programs schemas. They are mental frameworks, built from your earliest experiences, that filter how you perceive reality. What you notice. What you ignore. What you interpret as a threat. What you interpret as safe. Who you trust. Who you fear. What you believe you deserve. Here is a simple example. Imagine a child who grows up with a parent who is unpredictable, sometimes warm and loving, sometimes cold and critical, with no apparent reason for the shift. That child's nervous system, trying to make sense of the world, builds a schema, Love isn't consistent. People I love will hurt me. I must be constantly vigilant for signs of rejection. That schema gets encoded deeply in the unconscious. The child grows up, becomes an adult, enters relationships. And 30 years later, with no memory of those childhood dynamics, they find themselves constantly anxious about whether their partner still loves them, checking their phone obsessively, interpreting a short response to a text message as proof of abandonment. They do not know why they feel this way. It seems irrational, even to them. But the unconscious program is running exactly as it was written, faithfully executing software that was installed decades ago. This is the quiet tyranny of the unconscious. Not malicious. Not broken. Just outdated. Running old programs in new situations that do not require them. The first step towards psychological freedom is simply knowing this is happening. You are not your patterns. You are the one who can observe them. Chapter 2: The Two Systems, Fast Mind, Slow Mind. In 2002, the psychologist Daniel Kahneman won the Nobel Prize in Economics. Not for economics, exactly, but for revealing something so fundamental about how humans make decisions that it changed the way we understand almost everything about human behavior. His life's work, and the work of his partner Amos Tversky, can be summarized in the deceptively simple idea. We have two distinct modes of thinking, and they are constantly in conflict. He called them System 1 and System 2. System 1 is fast, automatic, effortless. It operates below the level of consciousness and produces most of the judgments and impressions that arise spontaneously in your mind. It is the part of you that instantly feels uneasy when someone enters a room and something about them doesn't quite feel right, before you have consciously analyzed anything. It is the part that recognizes a friend's face in a crowd in milliseconds. That finishes the phrase, bread and with butter, without even trying. System 1 is ancient. It evolved over millions of years to keep us alive in an environment full of physical threats and split-second decisions. It is extraordinarily powerful. And it is almost entirely unconscious. System 2, by contrast, is slow, deliberate, effortful. It is the part of you that engages when you solve a long division problem, or when you learn to drive a new type of vehicle, or when you carefully weigh the pros and cons of a major life decision. System 2 requires concentration. It depletes energy. It is, in a very real sense, the part of you that feels like thinking. Here is the critical insight. System 2 is not as in control as it believes itself to be. We like to think of ourselves as rational beings who occasionally feel emotions. But the reality, revealed by decades of psychological research, is almost the opposite. We are emotional, intuitive creatures, driven primarily by System 1, who then use System 2 to construct rational-sounding explanations for decisions we have already made. Psychologists call this post hoc rationalization, and it is more common than almost anyone is comfortable admitting. In one famous experiment, subjects were shown photographs of two faces and asked to choose which person looked more competent. Then, moments later, they were asked to explain their reasoning. They gave detailed, confident explanations, even though the actual choice had been made in under a second, long before any reasoning had occurred. The explanation was not the reason. The explanation was the story their conscious mind invented about a decision their unconscious mind had already made. This happens constantly. In all of us. Why does this matter? Because if we do not know that System 1 is running the show most of the time, if we believe we are rational, deliberate thinkers, we are susceptible to an extraordinary range of cognitive biases, emotional hijackings, and systematic errors in judgment. And the first offense against these errors is simply knowing they exist. Not in other people. In you. Chapter 3: Cognitive Biases. The Glitches in Your Mental Software. Your brain is not a camera. It does not record reality objectively and then play it back. Your brain is an interpreter, a storyteller, a pattern recognition machine that is constantly filling in gaps, making assumptions, and constructing a coherent narrative out of incomplete information. And in that process of construction, it makes consistent, predictable errors. These errors are called cognitive biases. And there are hundreds of them, documented across decades of psychological research. We cannot explore all of them today, but we are going to examine the ones that shape your life most profoundly. The confirmation bias. This is perhaps the most powerful of all cognitive distortions. The tendency to search for, interpret, and remember information in a way that confirms what we already believe. Once your mind has formed a belief about a person, about a situation, about yourself, it does not neutrally evaluate new evidence. It actively seeks confirmation. It notices the data points that support the belief. It dismisses, minimizes, or forgets the data points that contradict it. If you believe your boss dislikes you, you will notice every short email, every lack of praise, every time she passes your desk without saying hello. You will interpret neutral events as negative signals. And you will fail to register, or discount, every piece of contradictory evidence. The belief becomes self-reinforcing. Not because it's true, but because your mind is working overtime to prove that it is. The availability heuristic. Your brain estimates the probability of something by how easily an example comes to mind. How available the memory is. After watching a documentary about plane crashes, people dramatically overestimate the danger of flying, even though statistically it remains the safest form of long-distance travel. The vivid, emotionally powerful memory floods the mind and distorts the probability judgment. Meanwhile, driving, which kills orders of magnitude more people, feels familiar, controllable, and safe. We do not feel the danger because our minds are not flooded with vivid examples of it. Reality is what feels real. And what feels real is determined by memory, emotion, and repetition, not by actual probability. The fundamental attribution error. When someone else makes a mistake, we attribute it to their character. They are lazy. They are stupid. They are unkind. When we make the same mistake, we attribute it to circumstance. We were tired. We were under pressure. The situation was exceptional. This asymmetry, this tendency to judge others by their character while judging ourselves by our context, is one of the deepest sources of interpersonal conflict in human history. It fuels prejudice. It destroys relationships. It prevents genuine understanding between human beings. And almost no one is immune to it. The sunk cost fallacy. You have been in a relationship for 3 years. It is not working. But you have given so much of yourself, so much time, so much love, so much sacrifice, that leaving feels like all of that was wasted. So you stay, hoping things will change, throwing more of your precious life into something that is emptying rather than filling you. This is the sunk cost fallacy, the irrational attachment to resources already spent, which drives us to continue investments that have ceased to serve us. The rational mind knows the past is gone. The only question is whether continuing forward serves your future. But the emotional mind, System 1, cannot tolerate the sensation of waste. It would rather keep losing than accept that it has already lost. These are only a few examples. But they illustrate a profound truth. Your mind has a manufacturer's manual. And almost nobody reads it. The good news is, you are reading it now. Part 2. The Emotional Mind, Feelings as Information. Chapter 4. What emotions actually are. We have a cultural problem with emotions. In most societies, particularly Western, particularly masculine cultures, emotions are treated as noise, as weakness, as something that interferes with clear thinking, that needs to be suppressed, managed, overcome. Professionals are told to keep emotions out of the workplace. Men are taught from childhood that expressing feelings is dangerous. Even in everyday language, we describe emotional people as irrational, as if feelings and reason are opposites. They are not. The neuroscientist Antonio Damasio made one of the most startling discoveries in modern brain science when he studied patients who had suffered damage to the prefrontal cortex, the region most associated with emotional processing. These patients could still reason. Their intelligence was intact. They could analyze complex problems, understand logical arguments, hold long conversations. By every standard cognitive measure, they appeared normal. But they could not make decisions. When faced with even the simplest choices, what to order for lunch, whether to schedule an appointment in the morning or afternoon, they became paralyzed. They could list the pros and cons endlessly. But they could not choose. Because without emotion, there is no signal that one option is better than another. No felt sense of preference. No pull toward one path and away from another. Emotions are not the enemies of reason. They are the fuel of reason. They are the signals that tell us what matters, what to move toward, what to move away from, what requires our attention. And emotion is, at its most fundamental level, a piece of information. Fear tells you there may be danger. Anger tells you something important to you has been violated. Sadness tells you something valuable has been lost. Joy tells you that something aligns with your deepest needs and values. Anxiety tells you that an uncertain future matters to you enough to prepare for. These signals evolved over millions of years precisely because they are useful. They are your body's intelligence. Your nervous system's accumulated wisdom. The problem is not emotions themselves. The problem is when we cannot read them accurately. When trauma, suppression, or mislabeling distorts the signal. When we feel anxiety and call it laziness. When we feel grief and call it weakness. When we feel loneliness and numb it with busyness or substances instead of addressing the underlying need. The skill is not to control emotions. The skill is to become fluent in them. Chapter 5. The Neuroscience of Emotion, Your Brain on Feeling. To understand your emotional life, we need to understand a small but extraordinarily powerful structure buried deep in the center of your brain. The amygdala. The amygdala is almond-shaped. The name itself comes from the Greek word for almond, and it serves as the brain's threat detection center. Its primary job is to scan incoming information for anything that might be dangerous, and if it finds something, to trigger an immediate alarm response. This alarm response is what we call the fight or flight reaction. When your amygdala perceives a threat, real or imagined, physical or social, it fires a signal that floods your body with stress hormones. Cortisol, adrenaline. Your heart rate increases. Your breathing quickens. Your muscles tense. Blood is redirected from your digestive system and your prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for complex reasoning, toward your limbs, so you can run or fight. In a fraction of a second you are prepared for physical battle. This is a magnificent system when you are being chased by a predator. It is considerably less useful when you are in a difficult conversation with your partner, or receiving critical feedback at work, or checking your bank balance at the end of the month. The amygdala does not distinguish very well between physical threats and social threats. It does not distinguish between actual danger and perceived danger. And critically, it processes sensory information about 3 times faster than the reasoning centers of the brain. This means your body is already in a state of alarm before your conscious mind has a chance to evaluate whether the threat is real. By the time you think, I shouldn't get so upset about this, your heart is already racing, your hands are already tensing, and your access to calm, rational thought has already been significantly impaired. Neuroscientists call this phenomenon amygdala hijack, a term coined by the psychologist Daniel Goleman. The emotional brain takes control of the processing bus before the rational brain can intervene. Understanding this is not an excuse for reactivity. It is a map. And with a map, you can navigate more skillfully. Research shows that simply naming an emotion, literally saying to yourself, "I notice I am feeling afraid right now," activates the prefrontal cortex and begins to reduce amygdala activation. The act of labeling, of bringing the conscious mind into contact with the emotional experience, literally begins to regulate it. In neuroscience, this is sometimes described as name it to tame it. Not suppress it, not fight it. Name it. Chapter 6: Emotional Intelligence, the most important skill you were never taught. In 1990, two psychologists named Peter Salovey and John Mayer published a paper that would change psychology forever. In it, they described a capacity they called emotional intelligence, the ability to perceive, understand, manage, and use emotions effectively, both in oneself and in others. 5 years later, Daniel Goleman brought this concept to the world in his landmark book of the same name, arguing that emotional intelligence, or EQ, was a better predictor of life success than IQ. The claim was controversial. Scientists debated the methodology, but something in it resonated deeply with millions of people, because it named something they had always sensed intuitively. The brilliant but emotionally volatile person who destroys every relationship they enter. The intellectually average person who navigates the social world with extraordinary grace and builds profound connections everywhere they go. The leader whose technical expertise is flawless but who leaves a trail of damaged, unmotivated people in their wake. IQ gets you the interview. EQ determines what happens in the room. Emotional intelligence, as Goleman described it, has 5 core components. And I want to explore each of them, because together they form a complete map of emotional mastery. The first component, self-awareness. Self-awareness is the foundation of emotional intelligence. It is the capacity to accurately perceive your own emotions as they arise, in real time, without being swept away by them or denying them. Most people live at a significant distance from their inner emotional life. They know they feel bad, or off, or stressed, but they cannot be more specific than that. They have a limited emotional vocabulary. And without vocabulary, there is no precision. And without precision, there is no real understanding. The psychologist Lisa Feldman Barrett has done fascinating research showing that the ability to make fine-grained distinctions between emotions, what she calls emotional granularity, is directly linked to psychological well-being, physical health, and behavioral flexibility. People with high emotional granularity don't just feel bad. They can distinguish between feeling anxious versus feeling disappointed versus feeling defeated versus feeling ashamed. And each of those distinctions points toward a different root cause and a different appropriate response. Anxiety says prepare. Disappointment says revise your expectations. Defeat says rest and re-strategize. Shame says examine your values and your self-concept. Without the precision to tell them apart, you are navigating without a map. The second component, self-regulation. Self-regulation is not suppression. It is the capacity to experience an emotion fully, to let it move through you, without being uncontrollably driven by it. Viktor Frankl, the Austrian psychiatrist who survived the Nazi concentration camps and emerged to write one of the most remarkable psychological documents ever produced, described this capacity as the space between stimulus and response. In that space, he wrote, lies our freedom, our power to choose. Self-regulation is the practice of widening that space, of creating a moment of pause, however brief, between the emotional trigger and the behavioral response. This is not a natural gift. It is a trainable skill. And it begins with the body, with the breath. A slow, deep exhale activates the parasympathetic nervous system, the calming branch of your autonomic nervous system, and begins to counteract the stress response triggered by the amygdala. Simply breathing slowly and deliberately begins to bring the prefrontal cortex back online. This is not spiritual. This is physiology. The third component, motivation. People with high emotional intelligence are typically driven by intrinsic motivation, not by external rewards, but by a genuine internal pull toward growth, mastery, and meaning. They have a tendency to delay gratification in service of long-term goals. They maintain optimism in the face of setbacks, not through denial, but through a genuine belief in their capacity to learn and adapt. We will explore the psychology of motivation in much greater depth in Part 3. The fourth component, empathy. Empathy is the capacity to feel with another person, not just to understand their situation intellectually, but to genuinely feel the emotional reality of their experience from the inside. Neuroscientists have discovered what they call mirror neurons, brain cells that activate both when we perform an action and when we observe someone else performing the same action. When you watch someone pick up a coffee cup, a subset of your motor neurons fires as if you were picking up the cup yourself. When you see someone in pain, a similar overlap occurs in the pain processing regions of your brain. You do not just observe the emotional experiences of others. At a neurological level, you partially share them. Empathy, in this sense, is not a soft skill. It is a biological capability, one that can be cultivated or suppressed, but never entirely eliminated. The fifth component, social skills. The final component of emotional intelligence is the ability to navigate relationships skillfully, to communicate clearly, to manage conflict constructively, to inspire and influence others in ways that serve their genuine interests, and to build bonds of trust and genuine connection. This is where self-awareness, self-regulation, motivation, and empathy converge into action. And it is perhaps the most visible expression of a person's emotional development. We will explore the psychology of relationships in depth in Part 4. For now, let us continue our journey into the inner world. Part 3, The Psychology of Motivation, Habits and Change. Chapter 7, Why We Do What We Do, The Architecture of Motivation. What drives human behavior? This is perhaps the oldest question in psychology. And the answers that different theorists have proposed reveal not just the science of motivation, but the fundamental assumptions we hold about human nature. In 1943, the psychologist Abraham Maslow published a paper titled, A Theory of Human Motivation. In it, he proposed what would become the most famous model in all of psychology, the hierarchy of needs. Maslow suggested that human motivation operates in levels, and that lower-level needs must be substantially satisfied before higher-level needs become motivating. At the base of the pyramid, physiological needs, food, water, shelter, warmth, sleep, the fundamental requirements of biological survival. Above that, safety needs, physical security, financial stability, health, a predictable, ordered environment. Above that, love and belonging, connection, intimacy, friendship, a sense of being seen and accepted. Above that, esteem, the need to feel competent and respected, both by others and crucially by yourself. And at the top of the pyramid, what Maslow called self-actualization, the fulfillment of your unique potential, the drive to become everything you are capable of becoming. Maslow's model has been debated and refined extensively over the decades. The strict hierarchy has been questioned. People do sometimes pursue love or meaning even when safety is not fully secured. And Maslow himself, later in life, added a level above self-actualization. Chapter 8. The Neuroscience of Habits. How your brain builds automatic behavior. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine your morning routine. The alarm sounds. You silence it. Swing your legs out of bed. Walk to the bathroom. Brush your teeth. Perhaps make coffee. Perhaps check your phone. How much of that required conscious decision-making? Almost none of it. Habits are the brain's most elegant efficiency mechanism. Every time you perform an action in response to a specific context or cue, your brain begins to encode that pattern in a region called the basal ganglia, a set of structures near the center of the brain associated with procedural learning and automatic behavior. The more you repeat the pattern, the more deeply it is encoded. Eventually, the behavior becomes automatic, requiring minimal cognitive resources to execute. The brain has essentially outsourced the behavior to a lower-level processing system, freeing the conscious mind for more novel demands. This is extraordinarily useful. Without habits, you would have to consciously deliberate every single action, all day long. The mental effort would be overwhelming. But habits are completely indifferent to whether they serve you. The same mechanism that automates brushing your teeth also automates reaching for your phone the moment you feel bored, or eating when you feel anxious, or avoiding difficult conversations when you sense potential conflict. The brain does not judge. It simply strengthens patterns that have been repeated. And over time, those patterns become grooves so deep that executing them feels easier, and not executing them feels almost physically uncomfortable. This is why breaking a habit through willpower alone is so difficult. You are not just changing a behavior. You are fighting against neurological automation, against the literal structure of your brain. The MIT neuroscientist and Grabiel has described habit formation as having three parts, what Charles Duhigg later popularized as the habit loop. First, the cue, a trigger that tells your brain to initiate the automatic behavior. It could be a time of day, an emotional state, a location, a specific person, or a preceding action. Second, the routine, the behavior itself. Third, the reward, the neurological payoff that reinforces the pattern. The brain releases small amounts of dopamine in response to the reward, tagging the memory as important and strengthening the neurological connection between cue and routine. The key insight from habit research is this: you cannot simply extinguish a habit. The neural pathway remains. What you can do is replace the routine while keeping the cue and the reward. If you reach for a cigarette when you feel stressed, the cue is stress, the routine is smoking, the reward is a brief reduction in tension. The most effective intervention is not to fight the cue or deny the reward. It is to find a different routine that delivers a similar reward. Perhaps a brief walk, or deep breathing, or a cold glass of water, or calling a friend. Something that responds to the cue of stress and delivers genuine relief, without the long-term costs. The psychologist B.J. Fogg, at Stanford University, has proposed what he calls tiny habits, the principle that lasting behavior change is best initiated to extremely small, low-friction actions, rather than ambitious transformations that demand heroic willpower. You do not build a meditation practice by committing to 30 minutes a day. You build it by committing to 3 deep breaths after you pour your morning coffee. You anchor the tiny new behavior to an existing strong habit. You make it so small that failure is nearly impossible. And then, over time, the behavior naturally expands. Small, consistent actions, repeated over time, reshape the brain with the same quiet inevitability as water carving stone. Chapter 9. The Psychology of Change. Why it's hard and how to make it happen. If you have ever tried to change something fundamental about yourself, a habit, a pattern of thinking, an emotional reaction, a long-standing behavior, you know how difficult it can be. You make a resolution. You are filled with motivation, with clarity, with the certain conviction that this time will be different. And then, Sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly, you find yourself back where you started, feeling defeated, perhaps wondering if change is genuinely possible at all. Let me offer you something important here. That experience is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign that you did not yet have an accurate map of how change works. The psychologists James Prochaska and Carlo DiClement, studying how people successfully quit smoking, developed what became one of the most influential models in behavior change, the trans-theoretical model, or the stages of change. They found that lasting behavior change is not a single moment of decision. It is a process, a spiral, rather than a straight line, with progression, regression, and eventually, integration. Stage 1: Pre-contemplation. At this stage, the person is not even considering change. They may not acknowledge a problem exists, or they may be aware of a problem but have no intention of addressing it within the foreseeable future. If you are listening to this audiobook, you are almost certainly past this stage in most areas. But it is worth recognizing, because encountering someone in pre-contemplation and trying to push them toward action is almost always counterproductive. The role of external influence at this stage is gentle awareness raising, not pressure. Stage 2: Contemplation. Here, the person is aware of the problem and is beginning to consider the possibility of change. But they are ambivalent. They can see the potential benefits of changing, but they are also acutely aware of the costs, the effort, the discomfort, the uncertainty, the loss of familiar patterns. This is the stage where most people get stuck for years, sometimes for decades. They know they should quit smoking, or leave the relationship, or address the debt, or start the project. But knowing and deciding are not the same thing. The psychological work at this stage is not to gather more information. It is to deeply examine the ambivalence. To feel, fully, what it costs to stay, and to feel, fully, what becoming a different version of yourself would mean. Stage 3: Preparation. Here, the decision has been made. The person is planning to act and is beginning to take small preparatory steps. They are doing research, setting a date, telling trusted people about their intention, adjusting their environment. Stage 4: Action. The behavior is changing. The new patterns are being practiced. This is the most visible stage, and the one most people think of when they think of change. But it is also the most vulnerable stage, because the new behavior is not yet a habit. It requires significant conscious effort, and is highly susceptible to disruption. Stage 5: Maintenance. The new behavior has been sustained. The neural grooves of the new habit are deepening. The old patterns, while not gone, are becoming less automatic. The work here shifts from motivation to environment design, to building systems that support the new behavior and reduce reliance on willpower. And then there is what Prochaska called relapse, which he did not treat as a failure, but as a normal and expected part of the process. Most people make meaningful change only after multiple attempts. Each attempt provides information. Each relapse, if approached with self-compassion and curiosity rather than shame, offers crucial learning about the conditions that undermine the new behavior. Self-compassion, as we will explore more deeply in the next part, is not the opposite of accountability. It is its foundation. You cannot learn from failure if you are too busy punishing yourself for it. Part 4: The Psychology of Relationships, Attachment, Love, and Conflict. Chapter 10: Attachment Theory, the blueprint for all your relationships. Perhaps no area of psychology has had more practical impact on people's understanding of themselves and their relationships than attachment theory. It begins, as so much of psychology does, with childhood. In the 1950s and 60s, the British psychiatrist John Bowlby observed something that seems obvious in retrospect but was profoundly radical in its time. Human infants are born with a biological drive to seek proximity to a caregiver during times of threat or distress. Not just for physical survival, but for psychological regulation. The caregiver, typically a parent, serves as what Bowlby called a secure base, a safe haven to return to when the world becomes frightening, and a platform of security from which the child can explore and take risks. How the caregiver responds to the child's bids for connection, consistently or inconsistently, warmly or coldly, sensitively or obtusely, shapes what psychologists call the child's internal working model, a template of what relationships are, how safe they are, and what the child can expect when they seek closeness with another human being. Bowlby's colleague Mary Ainsworth formalized this into what became one of the most replicated studies in developmental psychology. The strange situation. In this experiment, she observed how infants responded when briefly separated from their caregiver and then reunited. From these observations, she identified what we now understand as 4 primary attachment styles. Secure attachment. Children with secure attachment had caregivers who were consistently responsive, not perfectly, but reliably enough. When the child was distressed, the caregiver noticed, responded warmly, and helped the child regulate. These children, when briefly separated, showed distress. But when the caregiver returned, they were quickly soothed and returned to play. Their internal working model: I can trust others to be there for me. I am worthy of love and care. The world is generally safe enough to explore. Anxious/preoccupied attachment. Children with anxious attachment had caregivers who were inconsistent, sometimes responsive, sometimes not, with no predictable pattern. The child never knew if seeking proximity would be met with warmth or indifference. As a result, these children became hypervigilant. They clung. They were difficult to soothe even when the caregiver returned, because they had learned that the return might not last. Their internal working model: I cannot trust that love will stay. I must monitor constantly for signs of rejection. I am only okay when I have reassurance. These children often grow into adults who experience intense anxiety in close relationships. They need frequent reassurance. They interpret small signs of distance as evidence of imminent abandonment. They oscillate between desperate connection and explosive conflict. Avoidant/dismissive attachment. Children with avoidant attachment had caregivers who were consistently emotionally unavailable, who responded to displays of distress with withdrawal, criticism, or blank indifference. These children learned, at a profound level, that seeking closeness leads to rejection. So they shut down the attachment system. They appeared independent, self-sufficient, unbothered. Their internal working model: I should not need others. Depending on people leads to pain. I am safer alone. These children often become adults who are comfortable with work and achievement, but profoundly uncomfortable with emotional intimacy. They pull away when relationships deepen. They describe feeling suffocated by closeness. And they often wonder, in private moments of honesty, why something always seems to be missing. Disorganized/fearful attachment. The 4th style, the most complex and the most associated with later psychological difficulties, occurs when the caregiver is simultaneously the source of comfort and the source of threat. This happens most commonly in situations of abuse or severe neglect. The child's nervous system is in an impossible bind. The very person I need to feel safe is the person I am afraid of. There is no coherent strategy for managing the distress. These children grow up without a stable template for what safe connection even looks like. Their adult relationships are often characterized by intense approach avoidance dynamics, deep longing for closeness combined with terror of it. Now, and this is crucial, attachment styles are not destiny. They are tendencies. Patterns developed in response to specific early experiences that become the default template for future relationships. But they are not fixed. they are not immutable. Research consistently shows that a single deeply meaningful relationship with a safe, consistent, emotionally attuned person, a partner, a therapist, a close friend, a mentor, can produce what attachment researchers call earned security, a gradual reorganization of the internal working model based on new relational experiences. You can learn security. You can learn trust. Not easily. Not quickly. But genuinely. The past shaped you. It does not have to imprison you. Chapter 11: The Psychology of Conflict, Why We Fight and How to Fight Better. Every relationship, no matter how loving, no matter how compatible, will encounter conflict. This is not a sign that the relationship is failing. It is the sign that two autonomous human beings with different histories, different needs, and different perspectives are trying to share a life. What separates thriving relationships from failing ones is not the absence of conflict. It is the quality of conflict. The capacity to disagree without destroying. The psychologist John Gottman spent decades studying couples in his Love Lab at the University of Washington, observing their interactions, measuring their physiological responses, and following them over years. From this research, he identified patterns that predict relationship failure with startling accuracy. He called the most destructive patterns the four horsemen of the apocalypse. The first horseman, criticism. There is a crucial difference between a complaint and a criticism. A complaint addresses a specific behavior. I felt hurt when you didn't call to say you'd be late. A criticism attacks the person's character. You are so inconsiderate. You never think about how your actions affect other people. Criticism triggers defensiveness. It puts the partner in a position where they must defend their fundamental worth rather than address a specific behavior. And it escalates conflict rapidly. The second horseman, contempt. Gottman identified contempt, expressed through sarcasm, mockery, eye-rolling, belittling, or hostile humor, as the single greatest predictor of relationship failure. Contempt communicates something devastating. I am superior to you. I find you beneath me. It is the complete negation of respect. And without respect, no relationship can survive. The third horseman, defensiveness. Defensiveness is the natural response to feeling attacked. But it escalates rather than de-escalates conflict, because it communicates to the partner that their concern is not valid, that the problem is actually their fault. The antidote to defensiveness is genuine responsibility-taking. Not capitulation. Not agreement with everything. But the genuine willingness to find the grain of truth in the partner's concern and acknowledge it. You're right that I didn't call. I should have. I understand why you were worried. That single sentence can de-escalate a conflict that might otherwise last for hours. The fourth horseman, stonewalling. Stonewalling, emotional withdrawal, going silent, shutting down, is the most physiologically driven of the four horsemen. It typically occurs when a person's heart rate has exceeded a certain threshold and the nervous system effectively enters a self-protective shutdown mode. Gottman's research showed that men stonewall significantly more often than women, not because they are less invested in the relationship, but because men tend to experience more intense physiological flooding in interpersonal conflict and take longer to recover. The antidote is the physiological self-soothing break, a deliberate, agreed-upon pause in the conflict, long enough for the nervous system to calm down. Not a withdrawal. Not a punishment. A break with a clear intention to return. Alongside these destructive patterns, Gottman also identified what separates the happiest couples from all others. He called it the sound relationship house, and at its foundation was what he called love maps, the degree to which partners genuinely know each other's inner world. The happiest couples are not the most conflict-free. They are the most genuinely curious about each other. They ask questions. They remember. They hold space for the other person to be a fully complex human being whose inner world is always worth knowing more about. Curiosity, genuine, compassionate curiosity, is the antidote to almost every relationship problem. Part 5. The Psychology of the Self, Identity, Meaning, and Growth. Chapter 12. Who are you? The Construction of Identity. Here is a question that philosophy and psychology have wrestled with for millennia, and that neuroscience is only now beginning to shed light on. Who are you? Not what you do, not what you believe, not what your history says about you, not the labels others have placed on you. At the most fundamental level, who is the one experiencing all of this? The philosopher William James, who is often considered the founder of American psychology, distinguished between two aspects of the self, the I and the me. The me, what James called the empirical self, is the self as object, the self as described, the accumulation of everything you know, feel, and believe about yourself, your traits, your history, your relationships, your body, your values, your roles. The self you can observe and report on. The I, what James called the pure ego, is the self as subject, the self as observer, the one doing the knowing and the experiencing, the witness to all of the above. Modern neuroscience has discovered that the brain has a default mode network, a set of regions that become most active when we are not focused on the external world but are engaged in self-referential thought, remembering the past, imagining the future, thinking about ourselves, thinking about others. This network appears to be the neural substrate of the narrative self, the story we tell about who we are. The autobiographical memory, the continuous, edited account of our life that gives us a sense of being a stable person moving through time. But here is what is fascinating, that narrative is precisely that. A narrative, a construction, an edited version. Memories are not recordings. They are reconstructions, rebuilt each time they are accessed, shaped by current emotions and beliefs, subject to revision and distortion. The you of 10 years ago is genuinely different from the you today. Different values, different knowledge, different neural connections. And yet you experience yourself as continuous, as the same person. That continuity is a story your brain tells. A necessary, adaptive story, but a story nonetheless. Why does this matter? Because if your identity is a construction, even a partially arbitrary one, then it is, to some degree, revisable. The belief, I am not a confident person, is not a fact. It is a narrative, assembled from selected memories, interpreted through particular filters, and recited until it became as solid feeling as stone. It is not less powerful for being a construction, but it is more malleable, more open to revision. You are not discovering who you are. You are, in every moment, deciding who you are becoming. Chapter 13. The Psychology of Trauma, How the Past Lives in the Body. We cannot have a serious conversation about the psychology of the self without addressing trauma. Because for a significant portion of human beings, the self has been shaped, profoundly, sometimes devastatingly, by experiences that overwhelm their capacity to cope. The word trauma comes from the Greek word for wound. And that is precisely what it is, a wound. Not a weakness. Not a character flaw. A wound. Bessel van der Kolk, one of the world's leading researchers on trauma, titled his landmark book The Body Keeps the Score. And in that title is the essential insight of modern trauma science. Trauma is not primarily a memory stored in the mind. It is a state stored in the body. When a person experiences an event so overwhelming that it exceeds their capacity to process it, whether a single catastrophic incident or a sustained pattern of chronic distress, the brain's normal memory consolidation process is disrupted. The experience does not get properly integrated into the autobiographical narrative. Instead, it remains in a kind of raw, unprocessed state, stored as fragmented sensory impressions, body sensations, and emotional states that can be triggered instantaneously by anything that resembles, even vaguely, the original experience. This is why a war veteran can be transported back to a combat zone by the sound of a car backfiring. Why a survivor of childhood abuse can feel profound terror in a perfectly safe room if something in the environment activates the old survival response. Why someone who was humiliated in a specific way as a child can, decades later, feel overwhelming shame from a mild criticism. The body does not know that time has passed. It does not distinguish between the original event and the current reminder. It simply responds to the pattern, with the same urgency, the same intensity, the same survival programming. This understanding has revolutionized the treatment of trauma. Approaches that rely solely on talking about the traumatic event, analyzing it, narrating it, trying to reason one's way through it, often fail because they engage the cortex, the thinking brain, while the trauma is stored in the subcortical structures that regulate survival responses and body sensation. More effective approaches, like EMDR, somatic experiencing, trauma-informed yoga, and certain forms of mindfulness practice, work by helping the nervous system complete the interrupted survival response and integrate the traumatic memory at a bodily level. Healing from trauma is not about forgetting. It is not about making the past feel less real. It is about putting the past in its proper place, in the past. Allowing the nervous system to come to know, at the deepest level, that it survived. That it is here. That it is now. If you recognize yourself in what I am describing, if you feel that your nervous system is still living in a past that your conscious mind knows is over, please know, healing is possible. Not just possible. For most people, with the right support and the right therapeutic approach, it is genuinely achievable. You are not broken. You are wounded. And wounds with proper care can heal. Chapter 14. The Psychology of Meaning. Why we need more than happiness. In the mid-20th century, Western psychology was dominated by a particular view of psychological health, the absence of disorder. The goal of treatment was to relieve symptoms, to reduce suffering, to return the patient to baseline functioning. It was a pathology model, focused entirely on what was wrong. In the 1990s, Martin Seligman, then president of the American Psychological Association, proposed a radical shift. Instead of only studying what was broken in human beings, why not also study what was working? What made people not just non-depressed, but genuinely flourishing? He called this approach positive psychology. And it launched an extraordinary wave of research into human thriving. One of the most significant findings from this research was deceptively simple. Happiness alone is not enough. Studies consistently showed that people who pursued only pleasure and positive emotion were not, in fact, the most fulfilled. Often, they were among the most anxious, because the hedonic pursuit of pleasure is, by its nature, endless. You achieve the desired feeling. It fades. You need more. The treadmill accelerates and never stops. What distinguished genuinely flourishing people? People who described their lives as deeply meaningful, who showed resilience in the face of difficulty, who reported high levels of both well-being and purpose, was not just the presence of positive emotions, but the presence of meaning. Viktor Frankl, whose work we mentioned earlier, explored this territory with a depth and earned authority that no other psychologist in history has matched. Surviving 3 concentration camps, including Auschwitz, he observed that the prisoners who were most likely to survive were not necessarily the physically strongest. They were those who had found a reason to live. Those who have a why to live. He wrote, quoting Nietzsche, can bear almost anyhow. Frankl's theory of logotherapy, therapy through meaning, proposed that the fundamental human motivation is not the pursuit of pleasure, nor the pursuit of power, but the will to meaning, the drive to find, create, and commit to a purpose larger than oneself. And he identified three primary routes to which meaning is found. The first, through creative work, through making something, contributing something, building something that matters. The second, through love, through genuine, committed connection with another human being, through truly seeing and being seen. The third, and the most demanding, through suffering, through the dignity with which we choose to meet the unavoidable suffering that life brings. The meaning we create not in spite of our pain, but sometimes through it. Seligman's model of flourishing, which he calls PERMA, echoes and expands on Frankl's insights. P. Positive emotions. Joy, gratitude, serenity, curiosity, love. E. Engagement. Flow. Being fully absorbed in activities that challenge and stretch us. Our relationships. Deep, genuine connection with other people. M. Meaning. A sense of belonging to and serving something larger than yourself. A. Achievement. The pursuit of mastery and accomplishment for their own sake. What is striking about this model is what it reveals about purely pleasure-focused living. Pleasure is only one component of the five. And it is, arguably, the most unstable. The one most subject to rapid adaptation and diminishing returns. The path to a genuinely good life runs through challenge, through depth, through meaning, through love, through growth. Through the things that are hardest and most worth it. Part 6. The Psychology of Growth. Becoming who you are capable of being. Chapter 15. The Growth Mindset. Your intelligence is not fixed. In 1988, Stanford psychologist Carol Dweck was studying how children responded to failure. She noticed something remarkable. Some children, when they encountered problems they couldn't immediately solve, crumbled. They interpreted difficulty as evidence of their inadequacy. They avoided further challenges. They became helpless. Other children, facing identical challenges, responded with what Dweck described as almost baffling enthusiasm. "I love a good challenge," said one 7-year-old. They leaned in. They tried harder. They persisted. What was the difference? Over decades of research, Dweck identified it. It was their belief about the nature of ability itself. The children who crumbled held what she called a fixed mindset, the belief that intelligence, talent, and ability are innate and static. You either have it or you don't. Effort is for people who aren't smart enough to succeed without it. Failure is evidence of fundamental inadequacy. The children who thrived held what she called a growth mindset, the belief that intelligence, talent, and ability are malleable, that they develop through effort, learning, and persistence. That failure is not a verdict, it is information. It is part of the process. These are not just different attitudes. They produce different brains. Neuroimaging studies show that people with growth mindsets literally process failure differently in the brain. They pay more attention to error. They allocate more neural resources to understanding what went wrong. They learn more effectively from setbacks. People with fixed mindsets, confronted with failure, show activation patterns associated with the threat response. They are defending. They are protecting the self-concept. They are not learning. Dweck's research has spread across education, sports, business, and parenting, with remarkable consistency. Environments that praise intelligence, "You're so smart," produce fragile, risk-averse learners. Environments that praise effort and strategy, "You worked so hard on that. What could we try differently?" produce resilient, curious, growth-oriented learners. The praise we give shapes the mindset we cultivate. And here is the most liberating finding of all: mindsets can change. You are not born with a fixed mindset. You developed it. And like all learned patterns, it can be unlearned, gradually, with practice and intention. Chapter 16. Self-compassion, the foundation of genuine strength. For most of human history, Western culture has operated under a particular assumption about how growth happens: through pressure, through self-criticism, through holding oneself to harsh standards and punishing failure relentlessly enough to prevent its repetition. Toughen up. Be hard on yourself. If you're not suffering, you're not growing. The psychologist Kristin Neff spent her career studying whether this assumption was actually true. The answer, supported by an overwhelming body of research, is no. Harsh self-criticism does not produce growth. It produces shame. And shame, unlike guilt, does not motivate change. It paralyzes it. The distinction between shame and guilt is crucial. Guilt says, "I did something bad." It focuses on behavior. And it motivates repair, the desire to make amends, to do better, to grow. Shame says, "I am bad." It focuses on the self. And it motivates hiding, withdrawal, or the defensive aggression that often passes for confidence. The inner critic's voice: "You are so stupid. You always do this. You will never change," does not sound like shame. It sounds like honesty. But it is shame. And its long-term effects are devastating. Self-compassion, as Neff defines it, has three components. Self-kindness, treating yourself with the same warmth and understanding you would offer a good friend facing the same difficulty. Not excusing failure. Not pretending pain doesn't exist. But meeting yourself with gentleness rather than brutality. Common humanity, recognizing that suffering, failure, and imperfection are universal human experiences. Not isolating the self in a shame spiral, but placing the experience in the larger context of what it means to be human. Mindfulness, holding painful thoughts and feelings in balanced awareness. Neither dramatizing them nor suppressing them. Simply acknowledging, this is here. This is what I am feeling right now. The research on self-compassion is remarkable in its breadth and consistency. People with higher self-compassion show higher motivation, not lower. They are more likely to take responsibility for failures and try again. They are less afraid of failure because they know they will not destroy themselves if they fail. They are more resilient in the face of adversity. They show lower levels of depression, anxiety, and shame. Self-compassion is not weakness. It is perhaps the most radical act of courage available to us, the willingness to turn toward our own suffering with gentleness rather than violence. The harshest inner critic in the room is almost never the most productive voice in the room. Chapter 17. The Psychology of Resilience, How Humans Bend Without Breaking. In the 1950s, a group of psychologists began a longitudinal study on the Hawaiian island of Kauai. They followed nearly 700 children born in 1955, many of them into families marked by poverty, parental mental illness, domestic violence, and chronic instability. By every predictive model available at the time, these children were expected to struggle severely. Most were deemed at risk for a wide range of negative outcomes. But something unexpected happened. A significant portion of these children, roughly 1 in 3 of the highest risk group, grew into competent, caring, confident adults. They had stable employment, committed relationships, a strong sense of purpose and self-worth. The researchers, led by Emmy Werner, spent decades trying to understand what had protected these children from the outcomes that had devastated so many of their peers. What they found shaped the entire field of resilience research. The most protective factor, by a wide margin, was the presence of at least one stable, caring relationship with an adult. A parent, a grandparent, an aunt or uncle, a teacher, a coach. Someone who was consistently present, consistently interested, consistently warm. It did not need to be perfect. It did not need to be 20 adults. just one. One person who communicated, through sustained attention and care, that this child was worth knowing, was worth something. This finding has been replicated in resilience research around the world. The single most important predictor of psychological resilience is not genetics, not intelligence, not economic resources.
It is the quality of human connection. We are built to need each other. Not as a vulnerability, as a survival mechanism. Beyond connection, resilience research has identified several other consistent factors. A sense of agency, the belief that one's own actions influence outcomes. The internal locus of control that says, I am not only a product of my circumstances. I have some power here. Meaning-making, the capacity to find or construct a narrative about one's suffering that places it in a larger context, makes it bearable, perhaps even makes it meaningful. Adaptive flexibility, the ability to tolerate uncertainty, to adjust strategies when the environment demands it, to remain open rather than rigid when the world does not cooperate with one's plans. And self-regulatory capacity, the ability to manage the internal emotional climate well enough to continue functioning and engaging even under significant stress. None of these are fixed traits. All of them can be cultivated, strengthened, practiced. Resilience is not a personality type. It is a muscle. And like all muscles, it grows stronger with use.
Chapter 18: Mindfulness and the Observing Self, the practice that changes everything. In the 1970s, a molecular biologist named John Kabat-Zinn had an insight that would eventually transform medicine and psychology. He realized that the meditation practices he had studied in Buddhist traditions, stripped of their religious context, contained a practical, teachable set of skills for working with the mind that might be directly applicable to clinical suffering. He developed an 8-week program called mindfulness-based stress reduction, and he began teaching it to patients with chronic pain at the University of Massachusetts Medical Center. The results were startling. Patients who completed the program showed significant reductions in pain, in anxiety, in depression, and in reactivity to stressful events, not by eliminating those experiences, but by changing their relationship to them. That distinction is everything. Mindfulness, at its core, is the practice of paying attention, on purpose, in the present moment, without judgment. It is the cultivation of what many teachers call the observing self, the part of awareness that can notice thoughts, emotions, and sensations without being completely fused with them. The part that can observe, I am having the thought that I am worthless, as distinct from simply being in the experience of worthlessness with no distance from it. This distinction between experiencing something and observing the experience of it may sound subtle, but its effects are profound. When we are fused with a thought or emotion, when we are in it without any witnessing distance, it fills our entire perceptual field. It is reality. There is no perspective, no alternative, no exit. When we can observe it, when there is even a tiny gap of awareness between the experience and the observer, the spell is partially broken. The thought is seen as a thought. The emotion is seen as an emotion. A transient event in awareness. Not a final verdict. This is not detachment. It is not coldness or suppression. It is presence, the fullest possible presence, with the spaciousness to let experience be what it is without being overwhelmed by it. The neuroscience of mindfulness has revealed extraordinary things. Sustained mindfulness practice literally changes the structure of the brain. Studies show increased density in the prefrontal cortex, the region associated with self-regulation, compassion, and complex decision-making. Decreased reactivity in the amygdala. Increased thickness in the insula, the region associated with body awareness and empathy. Mindfulness does not just change how you feel. Over time, it changes the organ that generates experience itself. The practice is simple. Not easy, but simple. Sit quietly. Close your eyes. Direct your attention to the physical sensation of breathing, the rise and fall of the chest, the flow of air at the nostrils. Stay there. Your mind will wander, within seconds perhaps, to a worry, a memory, a plan, a judgment. When you notice that you have wandered, simply, gently, return. Without criticism, without drama. Simply, I wandered. I return. That moment of noticing, that moment of realizing you had drifted and choosing to return, is not a failure. It is the practice. It is the mental equivalent of a bicep curl. The moment of return is the moment the mind grows stronger. Every return is a small act of freedom. Closing chapter, integration, becoming whole. We have traveled a long distance today. We have explored the hidden architecture of the unconscious mind, the vast ocean beneath the surface of awareness that shapes nearly everything we do. We have examined the two systems of thinking, the cognitive biases that bend our perception of reality, and the emotional intelligence that allows us to navigate the inner world with skill and grace. We have studied motivation, the intrinsic drives that power genuine engagement, the neuroscience of habits, and how lasting change is built through understanding the brain's automation systems. The stages of change, and why setbacks are not failures but inevitable stages in the spiral of growth. We have gone deep into attachment, the blueprint for connection that your early relationships built, and the extraordinary possibility of earned security. Into conflict, and the four horsemen that destroy relationships and the antidotes that protect them. Doubt. We have faced the profound questions of identity, who you are, how that self was constructed, and how it can be revised. Of trauma, how the past lives in the body, and how genuine healing is possible. Of meaning, the deepest source of human resilience and flourishing. And we have explored the landscape of growth, the mindset that makes learning possible, the self-compassion that makes failure bearable, the resilience that bends without breaking, and the mindfulness that cultivates the observing self. What does it all add up to? I want to close with a simple but radical idea. The goal of psychology, the deepest purpose of all this understanding, is not to fix you. It is not to turn you into a better performing machine, a more efficient emotional processor, a more optimized human being. The goal is integration. The psychologist Carl Jung spent his life exploring the relationship between the conscious and unconscious minds. He proposed that psychological health, what he called individuation, was the process of becoming whole, of integrating the shadow, the rejected, disowned parts of ourselves, into a larger, more complete identity. Not transcending your darkness, not eliminating your wounds, not optimizing away your complexity, knowing yourself fully, owning yourself fully, showing up, with all of it, as a complete human being. The parts of you that you are most ashamed of are often the parts that, when understood and integrated rather than suppressed, become your greatest sources of depth, empathy, and wisdom. The person who has known deep anxiety understands fear with the richness that no abstract description can match. The person who has been through loss knows the weight of grief, and the impossible, gorgeous resilience that emerges on the other side. The person who has struggled with their sense of worth knows, with a certainty that no amount of comfortable success can provide, what it means to finally, genuinely, choose themselves. You are not a problem to be solved. You are a person to be known. The most important relationship you will ever have, longer than any partnership, closer than any friendship, is the one you are building with yourself. Right now. Every day. With every thought you choose to examine rather than obey. Every pattern you choose to question rather than execute. Every moment of self-compassion you choose over self-punishment. Psychology at its best is not a science of pathology. It is the science of possibility. The possibility of understanding yourself more deeply, of building relationships that truly nourish you, of creating a life that is genuinely aligned with what you most deeply value, of becoming, slowly, imperfectly, inevitably, more fully yourself. That possibility is available to every human being who has the courage to look inward, to sit with discomfort long enough to understand what it is trying to tell you, to grow not away from your history, but, with your history, into something larger. Thank you for spending this time with me today. Take what serves you. Leave what doesn't. And carry forward whatever small light you've found in the examination of the most extraordinary object you will ever encounter. Your own mind.